grew
George
darker
Harrison
with
n'a
time.
jamais haussé la
It
voix,
wasn't loud,
s'emportait
it
rarement dans
wasn't
les
public,
interviews. Et
and yet,
pourtant,
within
au
the
sein des
Beatles,
Beatles,
he carried
il
a
portait
quiet
une
bitterness that
amertume silencieuse
George
qui
Harrison never raised
s'assombrissait
his
avec le
voice.
temps. Ce
He
n'était
rarely
pas
lashed
bruyant,
out in
ce n'était pas
interviews.
public,
Hidden
mais
beneath
c'était
his
réel
meditative
et
calm
c'était
and spiritual
personnel,
pursuits
caché sous
was a
son
grudge
calme
that never
méditatif
fully
et ses
healed,
quêtes
but it
spirituelles
was
se
real,
trouvait un
and it
ressentiment
was
qui n'a jamais
personal.
complètement guéri,
The silent
l'outsider
underdog.
silencieux. Au début des années
They shared
1960,
chords, traded
George
records,
Harrison
and
n'était
bonded
qu'un
in the early
adolescent prenant le bus
1960s.
scolaire à
George
Liverpool
Harrison was just a
lorsqu'il
teenager
rencontra
riding a
Paul
school bus in
McCartney. Ils
Liverpool
partageaient
when he
des
met Paul
accords,
McCartney,
échangeaient
was
des
drawn to
disques
Paul's
et se liaient
confidence,
par un amour
and
commun
later
pour le
to
skiff
John
et le
Lennon's
rock'n'roll.
brilliance. McCartney was
était
older,
plus âgé,
sharper,
plus
and
vif,
more assertive.
plus affirmé.
When he joined Lennon's
George,
group, the
discret
Quarrymen,
et
in
influençable,
1958,
était
he was
attiré
only
par la
15.
confiance de Paul
That
et plus
moment
tard par le
opened the
génie de
door to
John
what would
Lennon.
become the most
Lorsqu'il
famous
rejoignit
band
le
in
groupe de
history,
Lennon,
where
les
George
Quarrymen,
impressed
en
John by playing the lead
1958,
guitar
il
line
n'avait
from
que 15
Raunchy.
ans. Lennon
Lennon
pensait
initially
initialement
thought
qu'il
he was
était
too
trop
young.
jeune.
Lennon and
dut
McCartney
organiser
dominated
une
the
seconde
band's
édition
early
dans un
identity.
bus où George
Songwriters.
impressionna
They
John
crafted
en
the
jouant la
vision.
ligne de guitare
George
principale
followed.
de
They were the
Raunchy.
primary
Ce moment
he
ouvrit la porte à
absorbed.
ce qui
And
deviendrait
as
le
the
groupe le
Beatles
plus célèbre de
skyrocketed to
l'histoire.
fame,
Mais dès le
Harrison
départ,
earned the nickname
George
sizing his
Harrison entrait dans
introversion.
l'histoire de
But to
quelqu'un
those
d'autre.
closest to
Lennon et
him,
McCartney
the quiet
dominaient
Beatle.
l'identité
In
initiale
part,
du
it was
groupe.
the press
Ils
romantic.
étaient
For a
les
while,
principaux
that was
compositeurs.
enough.
Ils façonnaient la
Sidelined,
vision.
even
George
suffocated.
suivait,
But in the
apprenait,
studio,
absorbait,
his voice
et
was
pendant
too
un
often
temps,
drowned
cela
out.
lui suffisait.
A
Alors que
man
les
who was
Beatles
beginning to feel
accédaient à la
he had
célébrité
musical
mondiale,
ideas. He had
Harrison
spiritual
gagna le surnom de
awakenings.
Pierre Beatle.
It was
En
something
partie,
heavier.
c'était la
Had a
presse
way
qui
of taking.
romantiquait
When he
son
offered guitar
introversion.
arrangements,
Mais pour
they
ceux
were
qui le
second
connaissaient
guessed.
bien, c'était
When he
quelque chose
proposed
de plus
songs,
lourd.
they were
Un
passed
homme qui
over.
commençait à se
Paul
sentir
especially
mis à
over.
l'écart, voire
George would
étouffé.
laterly,
Il avait
ever
des
the
idées
perfection out of
musicales,
malice,
des éveils
but from years
spirituels.
of being
Mais en
subtly
studio,
undermined.
sa voix était trop
Banned.
souvent noyée.
George
Lorsqu'il
wasn't just
proposait
left
des
out,
chansons,
just
elles
dominant.
étaient
It was an
écartées.
empire within
Lorsqu'il
the
suggérait des
Lennon-McCartney
arrangements de
partnership
guitare,
was,
ils
say,
étaient
he
remis en
ruined me
question.
as a
Paul,
guitar
en
player.
particulier,
And as the
toujours
group evolved,
perfectionniste,
the
avait
frustration
une
with
manière
he
de
was
prendre
left
le
behind.
contrôle.
Then
George
him
dirait plus
began to
tard, il
harden,
m'a ruiné
slowly
en tant que
warped into
guitariste, non
and
par
no one stoked
malveillance,
that
mais à
fire
cause
more than
d'années de
Paul
mise en doute
McCartney.
subtile.
The
Le
breaking point in
partenariat
the studio,
Lennon-McCartney n'était pas
driven
seulement
and
dominant,
detail-obsessed,
c'était un
had taken
empire au
on a
sein
de
du
facto
groupe.
leadership
George
role.
n'était pas seulement
He had
exclu,
grown as a
il était laissé
songwriter,
pour
both
compte.
in
Et à
confidence
mesure
and
que le groupe
ambition.
évoluait,
But
la
inside the
frustration
studio,
en lui
the
commençait à
sessions
se
for Let It
durcir.
Be in
Ce qui
early
avait commencé comme de
1969 exposed the
l'admiration
cracks
se
that had been
transforma
building for
lentement en
years.
ressentiment. Et
John
personne
Lennon,
n'attisait ce
often
feu plus que
distracted
Paul
by his new
McCartney.
relationship
Le
with
point de
Yoko
rupture
Ono,
en
was
studio.
growing
Au
more
moment où les
erratic,
Beatles
less
commencèrent à
collaboration and
travailler
more
sur
quiet
l'album Blanc
collapse.
en
One
1968,
and
George
George,
Harrison
he was
n'était
done
plus
being
satisfait
overlooked.
d'être le contributeur
Paul was trying to
silencieux.
direct
Il avait
Harrison's
grandi en
guitar
tant que
part on the song
compositeur,
Two
tant
of
en
Us.
confiance qu'en ambition.
Frustrated,
Mais en
joy
studio,
at all,
les
if
choses
that's what you
devenaient de
want.
plus en plus tendues.
It
La
wasn't
dynamique avait
sarcasm.
changé.
It
Paul
was
McCartney,
resignation. George
motivé
pushed
et
back with a
obsédé par
calm
les
but cutting
détails,
line.
avait pris un
I'll
rôle de
play whatever
leader
you
de
want me to
facto.
play,
John Lennon,
or I won't play.
souvent
Infamous
distrait par
moment
sa
between
nouvelle
George and
relation
Paul
avec
was
Yoko
caught
Ono,
on tape.
devenait plus erratique.
Engineer
Et
Glyn
George, lui,
Johns,
en
who
avait
witnessed
assez
the
d'être
Let It Be
ignoré.
sessions
Les sessions
firsthand,
pour Let It
later
Be au
described
début
the
de
atmosphere as
1969
very
révélèrent les
unpleasant.
fissures qui s'étaient
A
formées
subtle
au
white
fil des
flag
années.
that
Les
said,
caméras
I'm not here to
tournaient
fight
pendant
you,
que
but
le
I'm
groupe
tired of
essayait
this.
de répéter, mais ce qu'elle
But to
capturait
those in
était
the
moins
room,
une
it was the
collaboration qu'un
culmination. Rarely
effondrement
quit the
silencieux.
band on
Un moment
January
célèbre
10th,
entre George et Paul
1960,
fut
of
filmé.
years of
Paul
artistic
essayait de
suffocation.
diriger la partie
To
de
the outside
guitare de
world, it may have
Harrison sur
seemed
la
like a
chanson
minor
Two of Us.
disagreement,
Frustré,
and George, no
George
longer willing to
rétorqua avec
suppress
une
the creative
réplique calme mais
process, had
cinglante,
become a
Je
battlefield,
jouerai ce que tu
was
veux
that
que
Paul
je joue,
didn't seem
ou
to
je ne
understand
jouerai
the
pas
weight
du
of what
tout
he
si
was
c'est ce
doing.
que tu veux. Ce
He
n'était pas
began
du
working on
sarcasme,
songs
c'était
like
de la
Something.
résignation.
After
Un drapeau
returning
blanc
to the
subtil
band a
qui
few days
disait,
later
Je
under
ne
New
suis pas
Turn,
là pour me battre
McCartney
avec
had a
toi,
vision,
mais j'en ai
and he
assez.
wanted
Pour le
everyone to
monde
follow it,
extérieur,
even if
cela
it meant
pouvait sembler un
steamrolling their
désaccord
ideas.
mineur. Mais pour ceux
But the
dans la
damage
pièce,
wasn't
c'était
undone.
l'aboutissement d'années
The rift
d'étouffement
between George and
artistique.
Paul, he wasn't
L'ingénieur
cruel,
Geoff Jones,
just
qui assista
controlling.
aux sessions de Let It Be
And
de première
here
main,
comes the
décrivit
sun.
plus tard
George had
l'atmosphère
finally
comme très
reached his limit.
désagréable.
Masterpieces
Le
that
processus
proved what he
créatif
was
était devenu un
capable had
champ de
widened
bataille,
into
et
something more
George n'étant
permanent.
plus disposé
And
à
while
réprimer
George
sa
may have
frustration,
returned to the
quitta
love when he
temporairement
was
le
simply
groupe
left
le 10
alone,
janvier 1900.
and
Ce qui
a part
rendait
of
les
him had
choses
already
pires,
moved
c'est que
on,
Paul ne
having
semblait
his
pas
own
comprendre
emotional
la portée de ce
ties,
qu'il faisait.
especially
Il
with
n'était pas
Paul.
cruel,
While the
juste
media
contrôlant.
focused on the feud
McCartney
between
avait
John
une vision,
Lennon and
et
Paul
il voulait que
McCartney,
tout le monde
Harrison
la
was
suive,
quietly
même si
cut
cela
unions.
signifiait
But
écraser
behind the
leurs idées.
scenes, Split
George
wasn't
avait
just
enfin atteint sa
professional,
limite.
it was
Après
deeply
être revenu
personal.
dans le groupe quelques jours
When
plus tard
friendship
sous de
turned
nouvelles
cold,
conditions,
The Beatles officially broke up in 1970, but for George Harrison, the public saw polite interviews and staged it was a creative and commercial triumph, and it didn't go unnoticed. The song as a thinly veiled had been building for years. Let go of the resentment that George was struggling to let. The title was a metaphor for the emotional noise and frustration George endured, and many interpreted by his former bandmates. One track in particular, at Paul McCartney's domineering behavior during their final, but lyrically it was biting. Wah Wah stood out. On the surface it sounded upbeat. Even Harrison's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, later said that George never truly liked Paul's personality. In 1973, Harrison released Sue Me, Sue You Blues, another pointed commentary. Years as a group. The bitterness didn't stop there, this time about the legal battles that followed the breakup. While the song addressed McCartney, who had initiated the lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership, expressed the group as a whole, it was clear that much of his frustration was aimed at that move, while necessary, for drama, but because it cemented how far apart they had grown, felt like betrayal to Harrison. Not just because of the surviving Beatles reunited for the anthology project, but even then, old habits resurfaced. Professionally, they made brief attempts to work together again. In 1994, but I don't think they really loved each other. Overwhelmed by the constant arguments, especially with Paul, she described how George would come home from recording sessions filled with anger. She said, they tolerated each other. Time had passed, but the wounds hadn't really healed. In private, he would roll his eyes at George still found Paul the diplomat in public, admitted they still got on each other's nerves. McCartney's suggestions, and Paul, ever in his Beatles years, still lingered, especially when by the mid-1970s George Harrison had already carved out a successful solo career, a guitar silenced career, but the scars from came to Paul McCartney. In a 1970, George spoke candidly about something few had. 5 radio interview with Alan Freeman. I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul. He ruined me as a guitar player. It was a devastating statement, quiet but sharp. I'd heard him admit aloud. George wasn't saying Paul had done it maliciously. The comment revealed how psychologically damaging those years under McCartney's influence had been. Coming from a man revered for his guitar work on songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, he'd spent too much time playing what someone else wanted, and too little. Paul is a fine bass player, he said, but he's a bit overpowering at times. Second-guessed and micromanaged, had drained him of creative confidence. This internal conflict didn't just affect his playing. In the same period, George confessed he would gladly join a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul, time being heard on his own terms. What he meant was that the years of being overshadowed affected how he viewed collaboration. Perfectionism often meant control. For Harrison, the issue wasn't just music. That wasn't a slight. It was the reality of working with someone whose perfect Lennon, the wound that never closed. That realization, painful and quiet, followed him long after the applause had faded. Beside the Beatles, there had been very little space left for him. Paul McCartney were more visible, while George Harrison's frustrations with it was about space, about being allowed to grow. And in the early years of the Beatles, Harrison idolized Lennon. John was older. His relationship with John Lennon was arguably more complex, and in many ways, that sense of closeness, however, began to erode as the years passed. Lennon, alongside McCartney, had helped shape Harrison's early songwriting, even encouraging him to experiment with structure and lyricism. Sharp-witted and fearless, George saw him not just as a bandmate, but as a mentor. His bond with George grew distant. As Lennon became increasingly absorbed in his personal life, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono, George found himself emotionally shut out. He mocked Harrison's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality, treating it with sarcasm rather than... And unlike McCartney's dominating studio presence, John, who once took pride in his presence, Lennon's indifference cut in a different... He received little more than eye rolls. George had turned to meditation and Hindu philosophy as a way. George barely mentioned Lennon at all. Harrison later admitted that John could be, in over 400 pages of personal reflection, fans noticed, and it wasn't an accident. The silence was a message in itself. Age and distance had allowed him to reflect. He acknowledged John's genius and their complicated history, but the emotional scar never really faded for Harrison. Instead, Harrison expressed his grief through music all those years ago, a song that was both homage and subtle reckoning. Lennon was someone he had once followed blindly, and someone who had later made him feel invisible. That kind of wound doesn't heal easily, even with time. A quiet philanthropist and a spiritual thinker, and unless prompted. When he did, his tone... In 1994, George reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the Beatles anthology project. It was a media sensation. For the first time since their split, the surviving members were back in the same room, working on music together, completing John Lennon's unfinished demos, Free as a Bird, and Real Love. By 1997, Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer. He received radiation treatment and briefly went into remission, but the disease returned, this time in his lungs and brain. Producer Jeff Lynne, who had worked with George in the Traveling Wilburys and helped produce the anthology recordings, later recalled how George rolled his eyes whenever Paul got too controlling. During these final years, he lived mostly out of the public eye, spending time with his wife Olivia and son Donnie at their home in Friar Park. And in the end, there were some people George Harrison simply could never fully forgive. In admiration, there had been love, but there had also been bitterness, and perhaps one-sided. The forgiveness, if it came, was quiet, incomplete. Interviews, the unspoken tension between them had never fully dissolved. While Paul grieved publicly and George Harrison left behind a legacy of music, spiritual searching. His pain was real, and his silence spoke volumes. Through the decades, there had been... Do you think George and Paul ever truly made peace before George passed away?
Un philanthrope discret et un penseur spirituel. Pourtant, malgré son extérieur paisible, les résidus émotionnels de ces années avec les Beatles persistaient encore. Harrison parlait rarement du groupe, sauf lorsqu'on l'y incitait. Quand il le faisait, son ton était sec, réflexif et souvent teinté d'ironie. Il ne romantiquait pas le passé, il disait la vérité, ou du moins sa version de celle-ci. Dans une interview, lorsqu'on lui demanda s'il regrettait d'être dans les Beatles, il répondit: pas avec les autres, non. Cette remarque, bien qu'humoristique en surface, révélait à quel point les blessures étaient profondes. En 1994, George retrouva Paul McCartney et Ringo Starr pour le projet anthologie des Beatles. Ce fut une sensation médiatique. Pour la première fois depuis leur séparation, les membres survivants étaient de retour dans la même pièce, travaillant sur de la musique ensemble, complétant les démos inachevées de John Lennon, Free as a Bird et Real Love. Pour les fans, c'était un moment de guérison. Mais les initiés voyaient une histoire différente. Les vieilles dynamiques revinrent rapidement. George s'irritait sous la direction de Paul. Lorsqu'on lui demanda dans une interview ce que cela faisait de retourner en studio avec McCartney, Harrison répondit: c'était comme retourner à l'école. Le producteur Jeff Lynne, qui avait travaillé avec George dans les Traveling Wilburys et aidé à produire les enregistrements de l'anthologie, se rappela plus tard comment George levait les yeux au ciel chaque fois que Paul devenait trop contrôlant. McCartney, à son crédit, admit plus tard que les vieux schémas n'avaient jamais vraiment disparu. On se tapait sur les nerfs, mais on a surmonté ça. En 1997, Harrison fut diagnostiqué d'un cancer de la gorge. Il reçut un traitement par radiothérapie et entra brièvement en rémission. Mais la maladie revint, cette fois dans ses poumons et son cerveau. Durant ces dernières années, Il vécut principalement loin des regards publics, passant du temps avec sa femme, Olivia, et son fils, Danny, dans leur maison de Friar Park, un vaste domaine victorien à Henley-en-Thame. Même face à la maladie, l'esprit de George restait intact. Lors d'un chat en ligne Yahoo en 2001, l'une de ses dernières apparitions publiques, on lui demanda « Est-ce que Paul vous agace encore ?» George ne répondit pas directement. Au lieu de cela, il cita un vieux proverbe victorien « Ne scrute pas un ami avec un microscope. Tu connais ses défauts, alors laisse passer ses faiblesses. » C'était du Harrison pur, philosophique, élégant, mais incontestablement pointu. Alors que son état s'aggravait, Harrison reçut la visite d'amis proches. L'un d'eux était Paul McCartney. La rencontre fut calme et personnelle. Paul décrivit plus tard comment ils s'étaient assis ensemble, se tenant la main, un geste qu'aucun des deux n'aurait fait dans leur jeunesse. « C'était mon petit frère », dit Paul dans une interview en 2000. On plaisantait, on parlait de choses légères. C'était comme si nous rêvions. George Harrison mourut le 29 novembre 2001 dans la maison d'un ami à Los Angeles, entouré de ses proches. Ses derniers mots, selon Olivia, furent simples « Aimez-vous les uns les autres ». Mais même dans la mort, les complexités de ces relations persistaient. Alors que Paul pleurait publiquement et parlait chaleureusement de George dans les interviews, la tension tacite entre eux ne s'était jamais complètement dissipée. Le pardon, s'il est venu, fut discret, incomplet et peut-être unilatéral. George Harrison laissa derrière lui un héritage de musique, de quête spirituelle et de rébellion silencieuse. Il n'avait jamais été le Beatle le plus bruyant, mais sa douleur était réelle, et son silence en disait long. Au fil des décennies, il y avait eu de l'admiration, de l'amour, mais aussi de l'amertume, et en fin de compte, il y avait certaines personnes que George Harrison ne pouvait tout simplement jamais complètement pardonner. Pensez-vous que George et Paul ont vraiment fait la paix avant le décès de George? Dites-nous ce que vous en pensez dans les commentaires. Et si vous avez aimé cette histoire, n'oubliez pas de liker, de vous abonner et d'activer les notifications pour d'autres récits musicaux inédits.